Hello and welcome to the World Bank Group IMF 2021 Spring Meetings and today one of our 4 days of public programming. I'm Paul Blake and in a few minutes we'll kick off today's session on economic recovery and how we can build a green, resilient and inclusive future. But first, let's take a moment to understand what to expect over the course of the week and how you can get involved. The World Bank Group IMF meetings are virtual once more, and while our buildings are relatively empty when compared to past years, you, connecting wherever you are, have more opportunity than ever to take part. For weeks, we've been convening and recording in-depth conversations with some of the world's leading experts on the most urgent development issues of our time. Now, for these spring meetings, we're proud to bring you 4 events that will play out over 4 days and cover 4 important themes: economic recovery, debt, climate, and vaccines. And while the main events are recorded, our subject matter experts are standing by live online right now to answer your questions and share your comments.
Hi, I'm Nejma Sher. As each event plays, my colleagues and I will be answering your questions in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic in the live chat at live.worldbank.org. And while you're here, please vote in our poll. There will be a new question every day.
And after each event, we'll be back here live from our headquarters in Washington, D.C. And on this socially distant set, we'll be putting some of the most popular questions that have come in online to senior World Bank Group leaders and experts. So what are you waiting for? Find all the details and share your perspective, live.worldbank.org. And if you're following the conversation on social media, use hashtag #InclusiveFuture to have your voice heard. Now I'll be back here in a little over an hour for a live discussion with the International Finance Corporation's Makhtar Diop and the World Bank's Manuela Ferro and much more. So please do stick around to join me for that. But now let's launch into it. Today's main event, Economic Recovery Toward a Green, Resilient and Inclusive Future, hosted by journalist Larry Madowo.
Welcome to everyone in our virtual audience around the world. We're so glad you could join us for the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings and for this kickoff event on economic recovery toward a green, resilient, and inclusive future. I'm Larry Madowo, and I'll be your host for the next hour. The pandemic has dealt the global economy an unprecedented shock, and the recovery is likely to be slow and uneven. Disadvantages and inequalities have been amplified, with harm falling hardest on poorer people, businesses, and countries. Today, we're going to look ahead to better times and to discuss what's needed to support a faster and deeper economic recovery that lays a foundation for a more sustainable and inclusive global economic system. And there are plenty of ways you can take part in this special event. We're streaming in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic on World Bank Live and across our social channels. World Bank Live is also where our experts are taking your questions right now. And you can share your comments at any point using the hashtag #InclusiveFuture. Let's take a quick look at what we have lined up for you over the next hour. Quite a lineup, right? Our guests will be focusing on economic recovery through three broad lenses. First, sustainability. How can we make this recovery green and rebuild economic systems to better use resources and create a climate-friendly future? Second, resilience and innovation. How can farms reinvent themselves to create more jobs? And how can governments find new ways to transform the crisis into an opportunity for growth? Can we avoid a lost generation of youth? And our final area of discussion will be on the topic of inclusion. How can policymakers make sure everyone benefits from the recovery and inequality is not worsened? To kick things off, we have a stellar trio. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, and leading the conversation, World Bank Group President David Malpass. They'll be talking about what it means to have a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Larry. It's a pleasure to be here with IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva and with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to discuss the economic recovery and the kickoff of our spring meetings. The world faces major challenges, including COVID, climate change, rising poverty and inequality, and growing fragility and violence in many countries. The inequality is most apparent in the direct effects of COVID that hits informal workers and the vulnerable the most. The inequality extends well beyond that to vaccinations, the concentration in wealth, the unequal impact of the fiscal stimulus and asset purchases, and the imbalance in debtor-creditor relationships, particularly for people in the poorest countries. The World Bank Group is leaning forward as much as possible to face these challenges. In response to COVID-19, we took broad, fast action and quickly achieved over 100 active operations of support for developing countries. Commitments rose 65% in 2020 from 2019. On vaccines, working closely with Gavi, WHO, and UNICEF, we've conducted over 100 capacity assessments, many even before vaccines were available. We are now passing several specific country vaccine financing operations each week through our board, with already 10 approved, 10 more scheduled in April, and around 30 more expected in May and June, for a total of around $4 billion in 50 countries. There are major challenges for the countries in securing deliveries from COVAX and manufacturers, and we're working to support their efforts. Many developing countries entered the pandemic with unsustainable debt levels. We've worked to achieve a debt service suspension initiative and increased transparency in debt contracts. Both steps are helping. We've dramatically increased our grants and loans to the DSSI countries. Our goal is to maximize resources available to people. And we're working in close collaboration with the IMF to support the G20's implementation of the common framework. We're pushing forward together on Chad, and the World Bank hopes to be able to put in substantial, fast dispersing resources. Chad has a heavy burden of collateralized debt owed to a very narrow group of creditors presenting specific challenges. And finally, we're finalizing a new climate change action plan, which includes a big step up in financing, building on our record climate financing over the past 2 years. It includes new analytical support to countries as part of integrated climate and development programs. We want to achieve as much impact as possible with the increased financing. Our plan identifies key priorities for action with a focus on both adaptation and mitigation. It also includes a strong focus on a just transition from coal. And we're working toward aligning our financial flows with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. To conclude, I've noted big challenges. We're working to bring together, all together, to achieve what we call GRID, Green, Resilient, and Inclusive Development. We'll have separate events on debt tomorrow, climate transitions on Thursday, and vaccines on Friday. And now let me turn to Secretary Yellen, and I'm so pleased you're here. Thank you very much for that. Dr. Yellen, it's been a year since we were on a presentation together. The world had a very hard year, and the United States under your leadership is having a big impact. Could you go through what's the U.S. doing to help the world recover economically from the crisis?
Well, thanks so much, David. It's a pleasure to be with you. Well, first of all, domestically, we're focusing on the pandemic and trying to promote vaccinations, testing, contact tracing to get it under control, because we recognize that for the United States and for the world as a whole, the pandemic really is what's going to call the shots in terms of how the economy does. So that's first and foremost at home, and I think it's equally important for the entire globe. We are trying to support the most vulnerable people who typically are low-income people and minorities in the United States, and the same is true globally, I think. Those who work in the service sector and minorities, vulnerable people have been most impacted, both health-wise and in terms of the economic impact. So we have many programs that are supporting them. Unemployment insurance programs, relief for rental assistance, homelessness, support for families that are burdened with women who are out of the workforce because children can't go to school, trying to reopen schools as promptly as we can, and support state and local governments. We've decided to go big because we think that the risks are of severe scarring if we allow there to be long-term unemployment. And we're projecting a pretty rapid, as we deal with the pandemic, we're expecting a rapid recovery. I'm hopeful we'll be back to full employment next year. And once we are, we're going to turn to a longer-term agenda of investment in infrastructure, in R&D, in people. But globally, I think that what we're doing domestically is helpful to the entire global community. Stronger growth in the U.S. is going to spill over positively to the entire global outlook, and we are going to be careful to learn the lessons of the financial crisis, which is don't withdraw support too quickly. And we would encourage all those developed countries that have the capacity, using fiscal policy and monetary policy, to continue to support a global recovery for the sake of the growth in the entire global economy.
Thanks. Fabulous. Managing Director Georgieva, you have been in the forefront of worry about the inequality in the system, and I wonder if you could give us some thoughts on that and what can the IMF do to ease the inequality?
Thank you very much for having me here at the bank. Fantastic to be with Secretary Yellen and with you, and if I may say, David. I am so grateful that you are focusing on this question of inequality. What do we see today? The world economy is on a sounder footing. The recovery is progressing, and actually actions taken by the United States to boost prospects for recovery in the US are helping the whole world. We are upgrading our projections for the year. But economic fortunes within countries and across countries are diverging dangerously. And this is why in these meetings we are focusing on giving everyone a fair shot. A fair shot in the arm everywhere, so we can bring the pandemic to a durable end, to underpin sustainable recovery, but also a fair shot to a chance for a better life for vulnerable people and for vulnerable countries. And it is so important for the reasons both of you outlined that it is a focus, because if we don't do it, then we risk inequalities to deepen and to hold societies and to hold growth back. What does it mean for us at the IMF? First and foremost, we have stepped up significantly the provision of financial lifelines to vulnerable countries, emerging markets with weak fundamentals, low-income countries, joining you, the World Bank, in making sure that those with limited fiscal space, no access to markets, are not left out from the recovery.
Dr. Yellen, Madam Secretary, you interact with the advanced economies a lot. What can everyone do working together to achieve an inclusive recovery?
I think it's the responsibility of the developed countries to make sure that decades of progress in fighting poverty globally and trying to close income gaps between rich and poor countries, we need to see that that progress is not reversed because of the pandemic. We need to provide a package of resources that your organizations can use to help developing countries, low-income countries. I hope that we'll make progress on approving an SDR allocation, which I think would be a very important way to support the reserve needs globally, especially of low-income countries. You mentioned tackling debt. I think that's an extremely important initiative, concessional finance for the poorest countries.
I want to turn a little bit, if we may, to climate change. These are immense issues for the whole world, and so each of us in our various ways are interacting. I went through our climate change action plan that we're just releasing. But I wonder, for the IMF, how do you think about the climate change issues in the context of the macroeconomic challenges that you work on, and how can the IMF help on this area?
Well, climate risks are a growing threat to macroeconomic and to financial stability. And with the same token, climate action offers the prospects for green growth and green jobs, critical for what we do at the IMF in supporting growth and employment. What we have embraced as a latecomer in this conversation is to zero in on our comparative strength. What is it that we are uniquely positioned to help the world accelerate the transition to the new climate economy? And it is macroeconomic data and research, fiscal and monetary policies, crisis prevention, crisis response. So what we are doing at the IMF, working very closely with the World Bank and other organizations, are 4 areas of stepping up our work. So it is at the heart of what we do. First, policy advice. We engage with all countries in what is known as Article 4 consultations. And when we do so, we look at the criticality of mitigation and adaptation policies. Naturally, we do more on mitigation in countries that are high emitters. We do more on adaptation in countries that are more vulnerable. Secondly, we are zeroing in on climate-related financial stability risks. And we have a big role to play: standardized reporting of these risks, stress testing, and looking at the role of supervisory authorities. We have an instrument together with the World Bank, the financial sector assessments. We are integrating climate-related risks in these assessments. Third, data. Data tells a story to finance ministers like nothing else. Integrating carbon intensity and other climate data in quarterly macroeconomic data is what we are pursuing, again, working with other organizations. So we are going to have a dashboard that would help policymakers to see in one place their growth numbers, employment numbers, carbon intensity numbers. Last but not least, David, capacity development. Countries need to speed up their ability to integrate climate policies in their macroeconomic policies, and we are there for them.
Janet, President Biden has talked about the whole of economy approach, and you've noted that poor countries often are not the ones emitting the greenhouse gases. How does the world better invest in this problem and solving it?
Obviously, climate change is a global problem, and we're not going to really be able to deal with greenhouse gas emissions successfully unless countries like the United States act domestically and then foster the transfer of resources and the financing that's necessary for developing countries to be able to do so successfully. President Biden is very focused on the U.S. climate agenda. He's going to be proposing a package of infrastructure and climate change investments to make sure that we make our own domestic contribution to meeting the Paris objectives. And we look to you and working with you in order to make sure that the necessary resources for green development and finance are transferred to the developing countries that really need those resources. And I think both of your organizations have very important roles to play, maybe distinct roles to play, as Kristalina was mentioning, but we need to make sure that we help developing countries meet their climate goals along with their development objectives, and the availability of green finance is critical to that.
We're running toward the end of our conversation. Are there other topics that you want to raise? I'll turn to Kristalina.
Well, the importance of us working together. We are in the spring meetings. It brings the world to concentrate on what we can achieve faster and more efficiently by working together. And I want to say two things. One, we are not giving enough credit to collaboration that has already taken place. In this crisis, central banks and finance authorities have stepped up swiftly in a coordinated manner. We just calculated at the IMF that if that didn't happen on this scale and in that degree of coordination, the recession would have been 3 times deeper. In other words, we would have been lingering into a depression. And that value of bringing everybody together cannot be overstated. And my second point is to take at least one cheer for our scientists that have delivered vaccines in a record short time. We owe it to them to make sure that everybody gets an access to vaccine. There is no more important economic policy today than doing exactly that. So let's use our coming together for building up the foundation of strong international cooperation for what you started from, David: green, smart, inclusive future for all of us.
Yeah, that's huge, both the cooperation side and the technology side. Janet, closing.
I would simply say I think resilience is important, and to me one of the lessons of the crisis is that the global system should have learned that we need to be better prepared for crises than we were for this one. This may not be our very last health crisis ever, and I hope we will learn that we need to work together to be better prepared for future crises. We've seen, certainly we in the United States have seen that our safety net wasn't all that it should be to protect the most vulnerable citizens. We have had to shore it up in a series of ad hoc actions, and I think making sure that our safety nets work here and throughout the world for future crises. Global supply chains, we saw weaknesses and problems in global supply chains. I think thinking about, we had very efficient supply chains, but not very resilient supply chains, and that's an area that I think we should be trying to shore up. And finally, I'd say we did a lot after the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 to shore up the resilience of our core banking system. And we should appreciate that we did not have a banking crisis. Our banking systems were able to support growth and credit. But some areas outside the core banking system of non-bank financial intermediation showed tremendous stress. So I think we have more work to do to have a more resilient financial system. And in all these areas, again, globally, we need to work together to cooperate, as in climate change, to make progress.
That's a great conclusion. So let's leave it there with resilience and the preparation for being stronger on the recovery and in the next global expansion. Well, fingers crossed. There's lots of work to be done, but that's a great conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And there is more to that conversation. You can watch the full discussion using the link you can see on your screen right now. Do you have questions about the issues raised in that discussion? Please share them on our live chat at live.worldbank.org, where you'll also have the chance to vote for your favorite question. We'll also be putting some of those directly to two of the World Bank Group's top experts at the end of this event. Now, the economic downturn prompted by the pandemic has had a particularly devastating impact on young people around the world. So, when they look to the future, what gives them hope?
COVID-19 affected Palestine in many different ways, especially that we are living in a conflict zone. It's impacted our education, our health system, and also our economy in a bad and tough way.
The main challenge that faced my community during COVID-19 was fear and anxiety, which was caused by limited access to accurate and reliable information about the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic has really impacted the psychological well-being of every demographic, but I think especially young people.
Il y avait déjà plusieurs jeunes, surtout dans les villages, qui n'avaient pas accès à l'éducation, dont un grand nombre se retrouvent être des jeunes filles. Aujourd'hui, l'écart ne fait que se creuser.
Y yo creo que las juventudes tenemos un rol prioritario en construir una recuperación verde, resiliente, inclusiva y justa.
We need to treat youth not just as beneficiaries of government programs, but also as partners. People we can collaborate with, forge complementary synergy. As leaders, people we can rely on to make decisions, to sit on the table.
Podemos crear cambios sistémicos a través de ideas innovadoras orientadas al desarrollo sustentable.
We need innovations around food value chain systems that can improve our immunity.
My hope for the future is that we will really center marginalized groups in recovery processes.
Para crear, por ejemplo, empleos verdes, ciudades sostenibles, una transición energética justa, economías resilientes, sin dejar a nadie atrás.
I hope that young people from across the world can come together.
This is their time, their turn, their future.
If we cooperate together and learn from each other,
we can not only beat this pandemic, but also be prepared for other future pandemics.
Tenemos en nuestras manos la oportunidad de construir un futuro mejor para todas y todos.
and find the silver lining behind this cloud that has been the pandemic.
Wow, those were really inspiring. Time now to tell you about another opportunity to get involved. It's our special poll question. Get ready. Here it comes. What should be the priority to ensure an inclusive economic recovery? Is it A, policy advice, or B, financial assistance, C, protecting the poor and vulnerable, or your last option, D, helping countries purchase vaccines? Go to live.worldbank.org to cast your vote right now.
Gamardoba, I'm Tamara Gobachidze in Tbilisi, Georgia, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
Now, we're going to turn to the subject of sustainability and a green recovery. Before we had a COVID crisis, we had a climate crisis, and it hasn't gone away. So, how can we use the rebuilding process to ensure that we don't go back to the way things were, but strive for a greener, more sustainable future? Here to discuss those huge issues are Swetinia Puspalestari, an environmental activist from Indonesia, and Karim El Eignawi, president of the Policy Center for the New South in Morocco. Ms. Lestari, let me start with you. You have seen firsthand the impacts of environmental degradation in your country, Indonesia. Tell us what you have learned in your work with the group you co-founded, Diverse Clean Action.
Thank you, Larry. So I've been working with Diverse Clean Action since 5 years ago, where we do a lot of works on grassroots level and also in top level advocacy. And we realized throughout our various activities such as citizen science and then also campaign, workshop, collaborations with private sectors, and also community development on a real coastal area on field, we realized that actually people really wants to change. People really wants to support this green recovery movement. People really wants to, speak up for the green recovery movements. But nowadays, especially with the pandemic, people tends to force to choose between economy and also environment. Because, for example, there's a lot of my friends that now losing their jobs because the pandemic situations. So now they cannot continue to do green recovery efforts. And they need to care more about their, security of food and etc. On the other hand, the opportunity for green jobs is not quite there yet for everyone in anywhere. It's still limited. And the other example is when the policy sometimes do not match the jargon of green recovery in terms of, small businesses. We can see maybe private sectors with bigger businesses, they do have strong commitment on eliminating single-use plastics, for example, towards climate resiliency. But when we're talking about small businesses, now they seldom they now have to spend more. They need to invest more on buying alternative solutions, alternative packagings, and they don't even get a reward or incentives from the government. So they again need to choose between environment and also the economy. So I think the most important thing is we need to invest more, and we need to make sure the ecosystem support the people, the normal people like me, the youth, can not have to choose between environmental and also economy.
Right. Dr. El Eignawi, since 2010, Morocco has had this ambitious strategy to reduce its energy dependence and promote renewables. How does that strategy fit into its new and more sustainable development model?
Thank you for having me. Well, it's at the heart of the Moroccan long-term growth strategy. I think in general, the world has not been very serious about climate in general and the energy transition. It is changing. I think the COVID crisis, in a way, has acted as a sort of wake-up call for many. And I think there is a lag also between policymakers and the populations that are demanding a more sustainable world in general. Morocco has taken this question very seriously and heavily invested and created an appropriate incentive framework for investment to happen in particularly in solar and wind powered energy. You have to know that the country is very suitable. I mean, our part of the world is one of the best in terms of wind and the intensity of light for generating sustainable energy from these sources. So I think you need to act, you need to be serious, you need to align your incentive framework for it to work. And you need, of course, to take it seriously. And I think that's what Morocco has done. So with the crisis, it's even more at the center of the strategy. And I think it's going to grow. And there are new plans to expand massively the solar plants and wind plants. You need the land to do that. And Morocco, again, has large pieces of lands. And nice exposure to wind and sunshine, and the proximity to a large market, which is Europe. So at some point, we will need to be part of the Green Deal, of the European Green Deal, and to see how we can interconnect all these sources.
All right, back to Ms. Lestari. You were talking about the work you do with Diverse Clean Action, but you actually founded it while you're still a teenager. What role do you think young people have to play in ensuring a sustainable future?
I think the way we can answer this, we need to see it on two perspectives. The first one on the youth itself. We need to empower more youth to, be more proactive on the local governments or the local efforts. And the youth need to also measure the impact of their actions. And we need to amplify our voices through, collaborations, because we cannot work alone. And we believe we can make greater impact if more youth does this. And the second perspective or second view is from ecosystem view. I think now the ecosystem is not quite there yet to enable the youth to make changes in terms of sustainability and also green recovery. For example, we need to set aside the age gap and also the institutional ego gap, because I understand that the older generation tends to have more leverage because they have the policymaker positions, they have the fundings from the big businesses, but the youth have the new innovative ideas and also, the maximum energy, the time to, really mobilize the movement towards this green recovery. But we cannot do it alone. We need the older generation to really listen and also give the chance to collaborate. And if it happens, it is actually, we can make a big impact, such as like my NGO. I remember when we started this 5 years ago, when I was still a student, I really knocked on the doors of the private sectors. And not everyone is listening. But when one company listens, and then we collaborate, and the impact is there. Now we are working with more than a handful of companies to really reduce the amount of single-use plastics, to work on resiliency of climate change. And also now on the pandemic situation, when we are listened by the policymaker, now we are successfully make hundreds of tourism workers can incentivize. And now they can work more on, changing the tourism into more eco-tourism sectors. And now they are preparing on the green recovery aspect. So I think it's really important for the older generation to listen and support us.
Excellent. Dr. El Ainawi, here's a question submitted by one of our viewers. Emmanuel asks, how can governments afford to invest in climate and environmental policies when they have so many emergencies to address, especially right now?
Well, of course, it's a matter of fiscal space, and it's a very empirical question. It depends on countries, but I think these are good investment, and this should be not specific investment. We should green in a way, to be simple. We should green all investments, all infrastructure we're doing. It's a posture. It's a way of looking at things. We need to minimize the carbon footprint of any fiscal budgetary spendings. Today we are asking from companies to measure their carbon footprint, their carbon impact. I think this should be asked from governments or from public spending. So every monetary unit spent by a government should have a measure of its carbon footprint. And I think also the fiscal policy should be adjusted for that. So it's a source of revenue. We need to tax carbon. It's been very difficult. It is moving slowly, but it is moving. And some countries are ahead of others. So that's a way also to generate revenues. But in general, I think this is a question that should be addressed at the global level. This is a public good for the humanity at large. When I pollute for you as well. So it's a public good. So multilateralism is essential to solve these kind of questions. And we need to subsidize. It makes a lot of sense to subsidize, to recycle excess capital that is going to some crazy sectors, I would say, that do not make a lot of sense. They make a sense economically in the short term. So it's a complex issue where we need human collaboration. And as you know, human collaboration and cooperation is something very difficult to be made. There's so much that nations can do by themselves. There is also a global level in this discussion. And I think the energy of the youth that was mentioned is fundamental here.
Right. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. El Ainaoui and Ms. Lestari, for joining us today.
Hello, I'm Pirom Kov in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meeting.
A reminder, you can use the hashtag #InclusiveFuture to share your thoughts on this event at any time. Of course, we know that recovery is not all about governments. The private sector has a pivotal role to play too. Let's hear now from some small business owners about how the pandemic has affected them and how they've adapted.
Durante a pandemia, nossos grandes clientes corporativos como hotéis, companhias aéreas e escolas reduziram drasticamente seus pedidos e os pequenos clientes como restaurantes e cafés faliram. Nós tivemos então que nos recriar, rever a formulação de produtos para diminuir custos, tornar mais assertivo e investir no e-commerce, que a gente conseguiu fazer dobrar de faturamento durante a pandemia.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought our business to a halt. Our clothing line sales was down due to ban on social gathering and events. Similarly, our training center was closed down. We were able to quickly switch to the production of face masks and other PPEs. The training center was equally able to move online.
මගේ ඊළඟ බලාපොරොත්තු වෙලා තියෙන්නේ කොවිඩ් කාල සීමාවේදී මට ඇතිවෙච්ච ප්‍රධාන ප්‍රශ්නේ ස්පෙයා පාර්ට් ප්‍රශ්නේ. ඒ ස්පෙයා පාර්ට් ප්‍රශ්නේදී මට බලපාපු ප්‍රධාන දේ තමයි ලංකාවේ මේ ආකාරයෙන් නිර්මාණය කරන්න පුළුවන් වුණා නම් කියන දේ. ඒ ලංකාවේ AC එකක් නිර්මාණය කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් කියලා ඇතිවෙච්ච අදහස.
Great stories there of innovation and resilience from people who've poured their lives into creating these businesses. Our next discussion also focuses on resilience and innovation by private companies, both large and small. Our guests are Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation, Shola David Bora, Chief Executive Officer, Africa Regions, Standard Bank Group, and Ajayta Shah, founder and CEO of Frontier Markets in India. Dr. Al-Mashat, let me start with you. This question was posted on our website. How should health and economic systems change to adapt to future crises? And what has the current COVID-19 pandemic taught us?
Thank you very much. Of course, the pandemic has taught us a great deal. It has taught us that for inclusion, social inclusion, health and education come as priorities. So it's a re-emphasis of maybe what all policymakers and citizens wanted to see happen, but it actually put it in the forefront. I believe that with what happened in terms of prioritization of health, there is a focus with respect to regulatory frameworks that governments have. There's also more invitation for private-public partnerships, which is extremely important because this pandemic has also taught us that no one can do it on their own. All stakeholders have to be involved, be them policymakers, governments, or private sector, civil society. And that was the only way to push forward. And if we're going to use the terminology, leave no one behind, the only leave no one behind is actually if all of us collaborate collectively within countries and collectively on the multilateral stage as well.
All right. Ms. David Bora, the disruption of global trade and its effects on commodity prices and exports has hit the African continent particularly hard. How can financial institutions facilitate investment and trade flows between African countries to build resilience and increase regional integration?
Thank you for the question. Indeed, the pandemic disrupted supply chains severely, and this impacted trade and investment. At Standard Bank, what we have done is to provide innovative financing solutions that would impact the value chains of key sectors. So, for example, in the agricultural sector, we partnered with a fintech in Uganda to come up with a B2B tech platform called One Farm. And what One Farm does is to provide a whole series of services to the Ugandan farmer. They can access financing, they can access crop insurance, agronomy services, and training. And this has resulted in yields going up by up to 38%. It's enabled the farmers to trade more efficiently across their region. And this is particularly important because, as we know, the AFCFTA started this year, and I believe that agriculture is going to be a key driver of intra-Africa trade. Therefore, the ability of ourselves and other financial services organizations to provide financing for agri and other sectors is very important. And this will also help to stimulate value-added investments in these sectors. Thank you.
And the AFCTA that you mentioned is the African Continental Free Trade Area. So let's move to Ms. Shah. Your business, Frontier Markets, had to pivot when the pandemic hit, from delivering solar power solutions to groceries and other consumer goods. How are you able to shift that quickly?
Thank you. Over the last 5 years, we've worked very closely with the IFC Lighting Asia initiative to work on a model which focused on investing first and foremost in rural women entrepreneurs who were critical in helping us get access to insights from the villages that they live in. These women in the last 2 years have now been on a digital platform that we created called the Meri Saheli app, which essentially allows them to collect data and communicate with us through a digital means. When the pandemic hit, it became quite easy to leverage that platform and collect insights around the challenges that the pandemic created, which, as we've just discussed, was supply chain driven, and it was about essential services and goods. Leveraging the data, we were able to then partner with suppliers quite quickly to tell them that there's an opportunity to bring 450,000 rural customers access to goods that they otherwise would not be able to reach. So we were able to pivot quite quickly because we had data that backed up the need. We had a network of women entrepreneurs that were able to then deliver that effectively, and we had technology that allowed us to track the efficiencies to create a win-win for everybody. Suppliers got access to new markets. Sahelis, these women entrepreneurs, earned real income. Customers got access to essential services, and Frontier Markets actually doubled in its revenue and its growth because of it.
Brilliant. Dr. Almashat, one question being asked by our audience is, can government promote local enterprise and self-employment, especially for women and other groups outside the formal sector? Can we support infrastructure and social services development?
There's no other way to move forward. The pandemic has actually allowed the acceptance of different modes of work. So today, remote work is no longer tabooed. It's actually something that is encouraged. And therefore, on a government level, there have been several decrees passed at the beginning of the pandemic, which allowed women in, for example, the government to be able to work from home if their children are less than 12 years old, or if they're pregnant, etc. On the other hand, the women issues related to the non-paid care, etc., have also become more tangible. People are seeing it given the brunt that has fell on women. And then when you mention innovation, when you mention small and medium enterprises, these have also proved to be more resilient when it comes to the crisis, and therefore encourage more, whether it is through financing, whether it is through more technical skills provided to women. In the case of Egypt, we were one of the first countries to have COVID-related policies, and we were singled out as the only country in Africa and West Asia to come up with a policy tracker and 21 policies related to women during COVID, and comes on the top of that providing technical skills, digital skills, because as we used to just talk about inequality when it comes to the income divide, but today the digital divide is something else which is extremely prominent. And therefore, in any policy discussion that a government has with its development partners, that it has with civil society, that it has with the private sector, this particular element comes in very forcefully. And if I just can conclude, all of us before COVID were either engaged in discussions whether or not technology is going to crowd out jobs. I think that COVID now knows that technology can be a catalyst, can be a driver towards more growth and being able to leap beyond the contraction that happened in the economy. And therefore, encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging innovation, making sure that the startup ecosystem and landscape is also encouraged, because that is what will add more resilience to the economies in the face of any shock that can come forward.
All right. Ms. David Bora, another question that was shared on our website was, how can greater financial inclusion help boost the recovery in emerging and developing economies?
Over 80% of businesses in sub-Saharan Africa are SMEs. Many are run by women, and most of them are in the informal sector. So we believe at Standard Bank that supporting and enabling this segment is a critical part of driving Africa's growth. We have provided an electronic mobile wallet in several countries, Nigeria, Namibia, Malawi, Botswana, Eswatini. And this mobile wallet is very easily accessible, by small businesses. There are three key channels by which they can access this mobile wallet. The first is a USSD short code. And if they do have a smartphone, it can also be accessed via an app. And we also have a widespread agent network where they can simply walk to an agent and get cash or lodge in cash. They can obtain financing from the mobile wallet. They can trade, they can transfer value, they can store value. And we have found that this has created a multiplier effect in the ecosystems of these businesses, because they are suppliers to corporates. They employ people, whether it's 3, 4, 5. This helps to create jobs. This increases income levels and ultimately assists in recovery and accelerating growth in Africa. Thank you.
All right, and finally, Ms. Chair, your company has scaled up its digital platform in response to the pandemic. How can digital solutions help businesses crisis-proof themselves for the future?
I think there's three critical elements when thinking about your digital platform solution. One is it co-created with the communities that you're looking to serve that are at mass scale? Second is it rural friendly and intuitive so that you're actually being able to think about the millions of people that today, as it just discussed, are not digitally savvy? So can it be voice enabled? Can it be vernacular? Can it be simple enough where the most remote rural woman is able to use it? In India, that's how we created our app. We thought about the 165 million women today that ultimately could be using this app and actually build an assisted commerce business in their village on their own, because there were AI bots and voice-enabled systems that allowed them to do that. The third element is also thinking about the power of data. Ultimately, technology is a tool that finally bridges the knowledge gap in a really interesting way, right? Rural customers are able to access information to make better choices, but also suppliers and ecosystem enablers will get access to trends and patterns that will allow them to give better insights to be either better prepared for crisis or have an opportunity to respond and co-create or innovate in the form of crisis, leveraging that data that can come into millions. So I think businesses today will be able to look at the matrices of access to efficiencies with technology, access to opportunity at scale with technology, but most importantly, also access to data and insights to be better prepared or respond faster.
Excellent. That is a good place to leave it, Ms. Shah, Ms. David Bora, and Dr. Mashat. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you've just joined us, welcome. I'm Laro Midowo, and we're discussing just what it will take to build a green, resilient, and inclusive economic recovery. We've got some great conversations ahead, but if you're interested in learning even more, we've pulled together some interesting stories and blogs. Just scroll down to the resources section of the World Bank Live page, and while you're there, please cast your vote in our poll. A reminder, this is what we're asking you. What should be the priority to ensure an inclusive economic recovery? Is it A, policy advice, or B, financial assistance? Vote C for protecting the poor and vulnerable. And your last option is D, helping countries purchase vaccines. Now, the economic impact of this pandemic has been particularly keenly felt by families. We asked people to tell us how their families were coping and what their hopes are for the future.
პანდემიამ აბსოლუტურად თუ ვისაუბრებთ შემოსავლების კუთხით, ნულია შემოსავალი. არ დამიკარგავს იმედი, უფრო გაფართოვებას ველოდები, უფრო წინსვლას, სურველიც ალბათ უფრო მეტია გამომდინარე იქიდან, რომ დაიღალა ხალხი. რამდენიმე წლის წინ გამიჩნდა იდეა, რომ გამეკეთებინა სასტუმრო. არ უშინდები პრობლემებს და მივმოვედი აქამდე. ჩემი უღლეს არ ჯეროდა, მაგრამ დღეს ძალიან კმაყოფილია. აღმოჩნდა, რომ ეს იყო ერთადერთი ჩვენი შემოსავალი. ჩემს გარშემო იყვნენ ძალიან ბევრი და არიან დღესაც, რომელსაც რაღაც იდეის დონეზე, მაგრამ ეშინოდათ, ვერ აკეთებდნენ და ძალიან ბევრი სტიმული, რჩევების მიმცემი და ჩემი მონაწილეობით ძალიან ბევრი კარგი საქმე გაკეთდა და ძალიან მოხარული ვარ ამით. მე იმედი მაქვს, რომ პანდემიის შემდეგ აუცილებლად იქნება უკეთესი. მიუხედავად ყველაფრისა, ველოდები გლობალურ ცვლილებას.
Coronavirus unwawa anamsa toni atitami ton kalatin kingrasi las karame ha window to kinam puhurin kalatin kingi kalatin yinti boligin wa pamanda libandi aya nanguso hantin gul manda tamti songma tam pam plaxleri ning ndorajum nosa tam bugum ke mamenga pam bugum ke kama kalna me pam bugum an kalma kolanga mamimi tiberara mamgulra hanking tori mamjakana yinere
Fofo, I'm Muslim Sidi Mohammed in Niamey, Niger, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meeting.
We're going to turn now to focus on the topic of inclusion. In just a moment, I'll introduce our next guests, but I just want to flag at this point that we'll also be hearing from Melinda Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, on this subject. So stay tuned for that. The pandemic has not hurt everyone the same way. Poor people and women have been more likely to lose their jobs, and the World Bank has forecast that by the end of this year, 150 million more people may be living in extreme poverty. Here to talk about what that means and how to address it are His Excellency Vongsi Visot, Minister and Secretary of State, Cambodia, Lindsay Coates, Managing Director of the Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative at BRAC, that's an international nonprofit organization, and Gonzalo Hernandez Licona, Director of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network in Mexico. Minister Visot, the impact of the pandemic on Cambodia was severe, threatening to push millions further into poverty. Your government rapidly expanded its cash transfer programs to over 2.6 million people. How were you able to do this so quickly, and what were some of the obstacles you had to overcome?
Okay, first of all, let me share you some brief background on where we're coming from. When COVID started hitting Cambodia, in March, early April, I was assigned to design the scheme to help people, to assist people, affected people. With the clear leadership of the Prime Minister, we cannot invent a new wheel. So we have to take into account what we have as the mechanism, social assistance program, social protection program under the social protection framework we have had. So we take all the system we have integrated into a one scheme, the so-called cash transfer program, which we never did before. Number one issue is we have to identify people where they are in terms of needed. We go to the village, to the home to identify the needs, the people in needs. So this more, I think, targeting than whatever ways. So given the ID pool system that we have in place, so we have the ID pool in Cambodia system that identifies the poor people who are supposed to receive the benefit of the government. So we integrate, the concept of ID pool plus, by upgrading the system so that we can identify the vulnerable people, the affected people, and the poor people who are supposed to receive, the assistance. So it's the number one thing. And the municipal plan, who took lead for several years, they are experienced with the participation of the local commune authority and local community to identify the people who are in needs. So, we have done this very quickly because the system in place. Number two, delivery system. Delivery system, we use the existing mechanism, which is supposed to, transfer cash to the pregnant women, children under 5, so vulnerable groups. So we expanded this system electronically, by using direct transfer to the people who in need. So people who are identified as poor, they got the card, and they will transfer the money through the digital system to their bank account in the rural areas. That will launch very fast. But at the same time, I have to tell you that we also doing with also the kind of oversight, coordination, and monitoring. There are two levels of monitoring. That I think at the high level we have a kind of monitoring system, but at the same time of the local level, the monitoring at the high level is about assessing the impact, the benefit that people receive. But at the local level, I think we assign the local authority, especially the district level and provincial level, to identify, to solve problem arising from the process of cash transfer, because you always have complaint about who's supposed to get, who's supposed not to get this, And by doing this, I think we managed to do it, I think, so far effectively in terms of cash transfer. So we start the cash transfer program since June. So only within 2 months we can launch this, could launch it quickly. And we pay about, $30 million a year, as a month, and up to now we spend over $260 million.
All right, thank you. Ms. Coates, BRAC's Ultra Poor Graduation Program helps the poorest people graduate from extreme poverty. What has been the impact of the pandemic on the people you work with?
Thank you so much for the chance to be here, everyone. BRAC is a Bangladeshi-led and founded organization, and it came out of a displacement crisis in Bangladesh 50 years ago. So it's very attuned to responding to crisis. I think what we have learned in our response is that the needs of the poorest are interrelated and multifaceted. I think the response you got from the minister really underlines that point. So if that's the case, our response has to be interrelated and multifaceted. So BRAC is working with people whose livelihoods are compromised, more so than if they were in a more formal economic setting, who are disempowered, particularly women, because of gender inequality, and who are really suffering. And what we have found in our response, we particularly focus on working with governments, is the interrelated response makes a huge difference. So we have done graduation work with the government of the Philippines. 99% of our program participants there have internalized hygiene messages, which is really important. 96% of those participants continued to receive their cash transfer from the government, which was critical. And 2/3 of them were able to continue livelihoods, which I think is remarkable. But you have to look at the whole human being and respond to them in an interrelated fashion.
All right, Dr. Hernandez Licona, we know that poverty and inequality are not just about money. Many of the poor are also deprived in multiple ways that may have been worsened by this pandemic. So how can we address their needs, not just for income, but also across other dimensions of poverty as well?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I mean, whether one believes in rights or capabilities or needs, I mean, it's quite clear that development is about many dimensions. And COVID showed us the importance last year. I mean, for instance, using a multidimensional vulnerability indicator, as the ones produced by Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, it is possible to show, for instance, that households with multiple deprivations in terms of water, undernutrition, lack of health services, cooking fuel, had a higher risk of being infected by COVID. The recovery then should be not only about income, but also about the reduction of deprivations. I mean, during COVID, inequality increased. We need then to go back to the situation before COVID. But we need to go even beyond this. We need to build back better. Otherwise, the next crisis will be even worse. I mean, if we really believe in equal opportunities for all, if we really believe in equal rights, in equal capabilities, I mean, then we need to believe in equity, which means necessarily, of course, improving the lives of those left behind in all dimensions, Larry.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to Ms. Coates to answer this question that's been sent in by Serwa from Accra, Ghana. Women are hit particularly hard by the crisis, with millions working in the service industry. How can international organizations and governments help to address millions of jobs lost?
I really appreciate that question, and I think it's really powerful. The other important thing to note is that millions of women are in the informal economy. So not even jobs, just simple access to livelihoods has been reduced, and the domestic burden of labor for women has gone up across the world, in my country and every other country. So that's a double whammy, to use a very American expression, for what's going on. So what should government do in response to that? Human capital and gender-based analysis of human capital is critical. Women are assets. Women are amazing assets. And governments need to think about how they budget to respond to and support women's increased livelihoods, their education, their well-being, their economic and social equality. And if we apply a gender lens to these big critical decisions, then we'll see the knockoff effect in increased employment and increased livelihoods and increased well-being for women. And I think everyone will benefit from that.
All right, and we're going to leave it there. Thank you all so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our final speaker also cares deeply about inclusion and has dedicated her life to working for equity. Melinda Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Hello. In the 20 years I've been working on development, the spring meetings have never felt more urgent. We all understand that we are in the middle of an international emergency. I hope we also recognize that we have everything we need to respond today in ways that make us stronger tomorrow. In institutions like the bank and the IMF, we have the power to act decisively. As a global community, we have the ironclad conviction that growth must be inclusive. It's an issue of fairness, and it's also an issue of good economics. Economic growth cannot be resilient when it leaves so many people out. The only way to rebuild sustainably is to make sure that all people enjoy the opportunity to build wealth and the security to withstand shocks. Let me be specific. This crisis has done disproportionate damage to the women and girls who have been forced to the margins of every economy. If we want to recover quickly and build a solid foundation for the future, we need to put women and girls front and center. That means reopening clinics and schools at full capacity as soon as possible and focus on making up for those missed health checks and lost learning. It means investing in caregiving as an essential infrastructure instead of simply expecting women to provide 30 hours of unpaid care each week. And it means targeting stimulus and social protection to informal workers, the vast majority of whom are women. 26 years ago, the world agreed to the Beijing Platform for Action on Gender Equality. If we had made more progress on it, our communities would have been better prepared to endure this pandemic. This June, the Generation Equality Forum in Paris offers us a second chance to follow through on our promises with political commitment, financing, and policy. I'm asking you here, and again when we gather in Paris, to make this recovery strong and sustainable by making it equitable. We have the power, we have the conviction, now we must act. Equality cannot wait.
Hi, my name is Patrick in Dublin, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
And now, to end our event on a high note, I'm really excited because we have a special treat for you. A performance by Ugandan jazz vocalist and songwriter Somi. She recently released a live album called Holy Room, which was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Jazz Vocal Album. That made her the first African woman ever nominated in any of the Grammy Jazz categories. It is such a privilege to introduce her today. She will be performing her song, Changing Inspiration. Let's hear why she chose that particular song for this event.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Larry. I'm thrilled to be performing at the spring meetings of the World Bank Group and lending my voice to today's event focused on achieving an economic recovery. As Larry said, my name is Somi. I'm a singer, a songwriter, and a storyteller. And I believe through music and art, we can inspire positive change in this world. Today, we've all been challenged to think differently about our recovery and transform the COVID crisis into an opportunity for growth. From Senegal to Samoa, from Guatemala to Rwanda, businesses are struggling. Our changing climate continues to disrupt communities. Artists are trying to make our way back to center stage, and exclusion robs individuals of their dignity and livelihoods. But today, I believe it's time we seize the moment to change direction and be inspired by the prospects of a green, innovative, and inclusive recovery, as beautifully illustrated throughout this event. After all, we can't build strong economies without jobs, equal access to opportunities, and a healthy environment. This song, Changing Inspiration, is dedicated to all of you today, working toward meaningful action. As you listen, I hope you can reflect on what it means to create a future that is brighter for those struggling the most. I invite you to imagine, act, and inspire. Floating above the horizon, sun staring back at me. I can see my desperate shadow, tight and it's holding me. Scents and sounds I remember haunt me with redemption. Greedy eyes take in the moment. Truth hides behind my fear. Changing inspiration, changing your direction. changing inspiration, changing your direction. Being case consumes me. I road trips on my heated words, staggering toes, circles, and doom. I pray I find it soon in a whisper of hushed undertones. The voice of struggle calls my name. Time passes before me, inspired by a need for change, changing inspiration, changing your direction, changing inspiration, changing your direction. Change, 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 change.
Changing inspiration indeed. Thank you so much, Somi, for that beautiful performance. Now, this marks the end of the first event in our spring meetings. There's so much more to come, including conversations on climate, on debt, and on the vaccine rollout. And you can share your thoughts on any of these events using the hashtag #ResilientRecovery. And stay tuned because Paul Blake will be here live in just a minute. That's all up next.
And it's good to have you back here live with us here in the World Bank Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. If you're just joining us, I'm Paul Blake, and over the next half hour or so, we'll be continuing the discussion on economic recovery, getting more of the youth perspective, and hearing about the climate challenges and actions in Egypt and Mozambique. But first, I'm delighted to be joined by Mokhtar Diop, Managing Director of the International Finance Corporation, and Manuela Ferro, Vice President for Operations Policy and Country Services here at the World Bank. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Paul.
And to start things off, we received a video question from Mark Alain. He's one of our One World ambassadors, and he's located in Haiti, and he wanted to send this question to you, Manuela.
Hi, I am Mark Alain, and this is one of the top questions that was asked on World Bank Live. Everyone is hoping for an economic recovery that is rapid, global, and inclusive. If that happens, are there any risks that this can lead to excessive environmental degradation and uncontrolled pressure on natural resources?
And Manuela, your response to Mark Alain?
That's a really, really important question, because at the end of the day, this pandemic has reminded us that we share one planet, we share one atmosphere, but we share it with each other and with future generations. So at the end of the day, we still need a very fast global recovery that really gets jobs going, private sector going, but at the same time, that also makes sure that we safeguard the environment, biodiversity, and the climate for the future. So at the bank, we have provided $83 billion in climate finance over the past 5 years, and we are stepping up our ambition to do more and to do better in the next 5 years. We are increasing our climate ambition so that 35% of the financing that we provide is for climate action. that we support countries and governments to implement their nationally determined contributions, that we invest in green and resilient infrastructure, and that we help countries implement their commitments as part of the Paris Agreement. So that's a really massive investment in not only in development, but development with sustainability, so that the economy of the future is able to be more resilient, and we do leave a planet that is resilient, sustainable, and green for future generations.
And looking for those opportunities in the recovery to make those green investments. And Mokhtar, the next question we got was from Manuel. He's in Ecuador. He was writing on World Bank Live, and he asked, how can we help smaller businesses in our local communities recover from the COVID-19 pandemic? And he added on to that, especially if there are different definitions of what a new normal is, as we start to recover and pull out of this.
I mean, this crisis has been showing us a lot of things. That you cannot live in a society without this missing middle. These people in the middle who don't have access to capital, to credit, to technology, to be able to create jobs. We know that MSMEs is the heart of job creation in every single country, being developed countries, being poor countries. Therefore, we have decided during this response to the crisis to put resources to support MSMEs, to give them working money for working capital, to help them manage their assets. We know that with this crisis, a lot of companies have their assets which are distressed, which are facing problems with their banks, and they don't know how to solve it. So I bring them some technical assistance to understand how to manage this asset better and to find mechanisms to be able to recycle these assets and give them a new life. So that's very, very important. This crisis also tells us something, is that all the boundaries are removed. Public, private, global, local goods. All these things now is mixed. The public sector, like Manuela said, has to turn to the private sector to be able to boost the economy. The private sector, without a stimulus from the government, cannot survive. So, and without that, without addressing the global public good and climate change, we have an economy which has stop and go with crises, Ebola, coronavirus, and all these shocks. So now we have a new opportunity to think about all these in a holistic manner. We put global, public, private, public to look at the problem of the planet is facing.
So looking for a comprehensive
Absolutely.
Approach there. And Manuela, for the next one, this is another question we got on World Bank Live, and I think it's really take us back to basics here. As Vice President of Operations, can you talk about how the World Bank is helping poor economies recover from COVID-19, just broadly the approach?
So we responded very quickly as soon as the pandemic hit. And we're working along 4 fronts. The first one and foremost is saving lives. Is providing the health support to countries so that they can fight the health effects of the pandemic. And now a huge effort on vaccines, supporting countries in having access to COVID vaccines that are safe and effective, and more importantly, also put them into people's arms. So that's the first pillar of our response. On the second side, we are providing countries with support for safety nets. Most of the developing countries have limited support for households where family members lost jobs and need support to maintain a livelihood and support their families. The third area of action is supporting firms so that firms can survive this pandemic and can be on the other side, driving the recovery, as Mokhtar mentioned.
I imagine you two are in touch a lot on that point.
Very much so, and that they are going to be the sources of recovery and of job creation in the future. And the fourth pillar we talked a little bit about already, which is really building the foundations for sustainable, inclusive, and green recovery that is both fast, but builds resilience into the systems and country systems so that they also are able to attract more investment, survive shocks better, be it natural disasters, be it climate, be it health, and do better on the other side. So it's really a comprehensive recovery where we're working with partners between the public and the private sector, but also with global partners, with our friends across the street at the IMF, but also UN, the WHO on health and COVAX. So there's really a network of partnerships that is helping us both at the global level and at the local level get this recovery going.
So everyone's sort of bringing their unique skills to the table and
Exactly.
capabilities to the table
Exactly.
to sort of fortify us going into the future.
Exactly right.
And Mokhtar, we got another question that came in online from Eunice Intebedzi. She's in Botswana, and she asks, access to clean energy services underpins many of the drivers for the Build Back Better agenda. How can we make Africa an investment destination for clean energy projects and investments?
This has been my passion. For the last 10 years, I've been talking about that. I've been working about that, and we've been working with Manuela a lot on these issues. Let me give you a couple of things that have been done in the last decade. When I was Vice President for Africa, I started in 2012. The cost of the kilowatt of renewable energy generated by solar was 23 cents. When I left, it was 60 cents. So huge leap forward. Technology is cheaper, is more accessible, is faster. Let's turn on wind energy. My own country recently have inaugurated one of the largest wind.
Senegal?
Senegal, yes, I'm from Senegal. One of the largest wind energy generated energy company. Countries are talking about hydrogen now, more and more green hydrogen. So there is in multiple front progress made on technology, which is becoming cheaper and cheaper. The batteries are becoming cheaper and cheaper. And so we have an opportunity now to really bring that energy. What is the constraints? Currently the constraints is, and that's where the work between the public and the private is so important. We have a lot of investors who want to invest in renewable energy. The constraints is that the grid is not robust enough. There is not enough distribution in country. And that most of the time is done by the state-owned enterprises. So the reforms that Manuela and the colleague at the bank are pushing for will help crowding in private sector and really bring a lot of electricity on the grid. We have a very ambitious program in Africa, the World Bank Group, which is called LEAP, where we are trying really to increase significantly access, and we hope that in the next decade we will be able to reach universal access in Africa of electricity, and we'll be able to do it in a clean way, because natural resources are abundant in Africa, being hydro in DRC or Cameroon, or being solar in the Sahel part of Africa.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being here. Mokhtar Diop, Manuela Ferro, really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you.
Hola, I'm Cynthia Flores in San Jose, Costa Rica, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
Well, throughout these meetings, we're highlighting the voices of youth leaders around the world, hearing their stories, perspectives, and suggestions for a resilient recovery from COVID-19. Today, we hear from Alina in Pakistan, Timitope in Nigeria, and Stephen in Kenya.
COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives, both economically and socially. In order for there to be a resilient recovery from the pandemic, youth has to be at the heart of it. In Nigeria, we youth are the catalysts of inclusion. We are active responders and we are role models.
Kenyan youths can participate in the resilient recovery of COVID-19 by creating businesses, starting small enterprises. These businesses will employ as many people as possible.
We as youth can help cause a resilient recovery from the pandemic, we declared, using our social media to spread accurate information and creating apps that will help us to integrate as a community, not necessarily face-to-face, but helping us to integrate and depending on each other.
Whatever initiative the youth is taking, they need to focus on the fact that we have only one planet and all the needs should be fulfilled, with a very special focus on inclusion as well as climate action.
They can also help by participating in the conversation of recovery, by bringing up ideas, new ideas that can live in this situation. Yes, COVID-19 is still going on, so we need solutions, we need ideas, and these ideas can be brought from youths.
Importantly, Nigerians, as we go through this pandemic, I want us to always remember that to win, we need to depend on each other and help each other. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Shigu Kacharia in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and you are watching World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
And And my colleague Srimati Sridhar joins us now on the set here at the World Bank Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. And Sri, throughout the week, we've been encouraging people to go over to live.worldbank.org, vote in our polls. We have a different poll each day this week. Remind us what the question is for today's event.
Thanks, Paul. So today's poll asks what should be a priority to achieve an inclusive and economic recovery.
And what are our options?
So the 5 options are policy advice, financial assistance, protecting the poor and vulnerable, helping countries purchase vaccines, and finally, debt suspension.
All right, well, let's go through these one by one.
Okay.
What's in first place?
First place is protecting the poor and vulnerable with 35.1% of the votes.
And second place?
Second place is policy advice with 19.5% of votes.
You can run us through the rest.
And in third place, we have financial assistance coming in at 17.9%. Helping countries purchase vaccines is 16.2%. And finally, debt suspension comes in at 11.3%.
And it's interesting, the protecting the poor and vulnerable, that one in some ways it kind of encompasses the other options. I can see why a lot of people out there would have voted for that one. Debt suspension, that's one that's obviously been a priority for the bank. We talk a lot about it. You can find some of that in the resources on live.worldbank.org for the event, both today and certainly for tomorrow's event on debt. Coming in 5th place, but I imagine that that one's quite a technical one.
That's probably why, yeah.
I'm not sure if I worked here, I would understand the nitty-gritty. I'm not even sure I do understand the nitty-gritty of it. So
I remember when I voted, my vote was with helping countries purchase vaccines.
Yeah,
but
it feels like the key to kind of unlocking the economies around the world. Well, let's jump ahead to our country profiles. So all this week, we'll be looking at the different challenges, triumphs, the actions that countries are taking when it comes to climate change. Today, we're going to first hear from Egypt, and I understand you've been talking to one of our World Bank leading experts on Egypt.
Yes, so I spoke to Ayat Soleiman. She is the Regional Sustainable Development Director for the Middle East and North Africa region. Start off by asking her what some of Egypt's sustainability challenges are. Let's take a look.
So if you ask me about the challenges that Egypt is facing, it is a country with the biggest population in the Middle East and North Africa, and one which is highly dependent on scarce natural resources. So if you just take water as a first natural resource, it is facing increasing scarcity and availability of water resources. And it's the resource that they depend on for its agriculture. 85% of the water is used for agriculture, which is making it, of course, highly vulnerable to any changes in that resource availability. The other example of resources that are scarce, natural resources, is arable land. And again, we are seeing that available land for agricultural production is increasingly under pressure with increased population growth and other dimensions of pollution, etc. If you look at that just in terms of the availability of resources, that's one dimension of challenge, of sustainability challenge. But then you add to it the environmental pollution, the urbanization challenges, and all of these resources are coming under increasing pressure. And finally, climate change is adding another dimension of pressure to the availability of these resources for future use. And we are seeing increasing risks of climate impacting water availability, droughts, floods, but also sea level rise, which could impact the Nile Delta and the coastal areas with coastal erosion, sea level intrusion, and impact the Delta area, which is where the majority of the population live.
And speaking of challenges, let's talk about COVID-19. How has the World Bank been helping Egypt bounce back from the pandemic?
Well, first I would like to say that actually Egypt, compared to other Middle East and North Africa countries, has been rather resilient in the face of the pandemic. It has seen growth rates of about 5% GDP growth compared to negative growth rates in some of the other countries in MENA. But at the same time, of course, the pandemic has hit, and it has hit hard across the globe. And so flows of investment, flows of tourists and jobs, the opportunities as a result of that have, of course, suffered. And we have, as the World Bank Group, also engaged Egypt very much in the first response of the pandemic, whether it is on the health side or social protection side, to help the most vulnerable groups in terms of the first response to the pandemic. And at the same time, we have engaged on some of the broader recovery frame in terms of enabling and supporting a green, inclusive, and resilient recovery.
And how has the bank also been supporting the country in taking ambitious climate action?
The first one is food systems. water scarcity and natural capital, and really looking at the transformation of agriculture to climate smart agriculture, resilient agriculture, better farming practices, introducing the technologies, looking at water use efficiency and making every drop of water count. The second area is on clean energy and low carbon mobility. That's also another one I mentioned. I mentioned the Benban example and also the Cairo air pollution, but more can be done. And I know that Egypt has ambitious targets for renewable energy, and we would look forward to helping Egypt in assessing the cost of transition, looking at options and prioritizing the opportunities that would be best for job creation as well as long-term sustainability. The third area is around climate smart cities and resilient coastal economies. And I mentioned that because sea level rise, but also increasing urbanization are really quite increasing risks for countries like Egypt with high populations and high population living on coastal areas. And then the final area is on climate finance and a whole of government approach. How to attract green investments, including with the private sector, to a country like Egypt based on ambitious agendas.
And finally, Ayad, before I let you go, what gives you hope and inspires you in the job that you're doing?
If you ask me from where I sit, especially in the Middle East and North Africa region, I think two things give me hope. One is young people, their passion and their demands for a better future. And the second thing that gives me hope is innovation. There's so much innovation happening in sustainable development areas. All these innovations, many of which actually are coming from young people that are passionate about development and about sustainable development, give me hope, because those are the solutions of the future. And I think that combination is what going to make the future more sustainable and more resilient.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here today, Ayad, and for telling us more about the World Bank's role in Egypt.
Hi, I am Fakhril Faiz, and you're watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
And Shri, throughout these meetings, we're encouraging people to use the hashtag Resilient Recovery to talk about the week. And then today, the hashtag is Inclusive Future. You've been talking to some of our social media experts. We have live bloggers online who are following the conversation and answering people's questions. And then our social media experts who are sort of following the conversation across Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and a number of other platforms. What have they been telling you about what the conversation's been like?
So, Paul, I just spoke to them. The conversation today has been great for hashtag Inclusive Future. It's been mentioned over 1,000 times on social. And the conversation is still going, especially in countries like Nigeria, Egypt, France, and the UK.
Hello to everyone who's out there in those countries and everywhere else. Talk to me a little bit more about what they're telling you.
So we have some special shout outs here that I'd like to give out. We have Fahim Azizi, who's watching from Afghanistan, Imogen Wade in the UK, Ali Khan Sachu in Kenya, Chuchu Mapaku in Cameroon, and Alejandro Garcia in Peru. So big hi to all of you.
Yes, hello. And we've been given a list of some of the notable messages and tweets. Why don't we go through a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. So the first, we have youth advocate Niel Deng from Kenya and Josh Alad from Nigeria, who are here with us, who have joined the conversation on Twitter, as well as a Haitian technologist, economist, and One Young World fellow, Mark Elaine.
Yeah, Mark Elaine has actually sent us that question from Mokhtar earlier.
Oh,
so if
awesome.
you missed that, you can watch it back a little later on. We also had Bente Mikkelsen from the World Health Organization, who advocated for an inclusive future by tweeting about how those with diabetes are at an increased risk of severe disease and death from COVID-19. And run us through a couple more of the other ones.
Well, we also have the UNICEF's Gonzalo Lacona, One Young World, and thank you to Marhana at the UNDP for encouraging everyone on Twitter to follow the inclusive future and resilient recovery discussion. So that's great.
And finally, John Sword from the Bretton Woods Project calls for more resources for green development. He'll definitely, and anyone else interested in that, want to tune in on Thursday for our event on climate and green recovery. But thank you so much, and thanks to all of our social media experts and the people who are out there joining the conversation online. Let's do another country spotlight now.
Let's do it.
For this one, we're going to go to Mozambique, and it's from the region that I spoke to, Hector Gomez Ang. He's the International Finance Corporation's country manager for Mozambique and a number of other countries in that sort of neighborhood there. Spoke to him specifically about Mozambique, and I asked him about the challenges that Mozambicans are facing when it comes to climate change.
So, maybe a little bit of context. Mozambique is a 30 million people country. It's a very low-income country. It's a high inequality. More than 60% of people live in poverty, right? So, and it's very, very dependent on donors. So this is the context, very very, very structural issues. And at the same time, it's been in a crisis since 2016. And then that's been compounded with COVID, and it's been compounded with the hurricanes that it just suffered 2 years ago. So that's sort of the setting, but it's a country that has massive potential. Okay, so it has a lot of mineral resources. It has natural gas reserves that are projects that are already ongoing and will bring a lot of investment into the country. And it's a country that has a lot of agricultural resources, right? So I think really the challenge, if you need to sum it up, is how can Mozambique move forward and take advantage of those resources in a sustainable and inclusive way, in a way that it benefits the people of Mozambique.
And let's talk about that a little bit. You're the country manager for the International Finance Corporation for Mozambique and a number of other countries in the neighborhood there. What's the long-term strategy in Mozambique?
For Mozambique, we follow a very disciplined approach, right? So we just went through a very in-depth study about the opportunities for the private sector, and we identified, there is agribusiness, there is energy, there is tourism, there is transport and logistics, given Mozambique's position. And we also came to the conclusion that we will need a different approach. That what brought us here won't take us forward. So what we're using or doing in Mozambique is we're using every single tool that the World Bank Group has, that IFC and the World Bank Group has. So in terms of financing, in terms of funding, we're using everything. And we also approaching it in a different way because it's such a complex problem in Mozambique that no single institution can deal with them on its own, right?
Let's talk about a specific project. I understand the International Finance Corporation has invested in the first large-scale solar plant in Mozambique. I believe it's called the Macuba Solar Project. Tell us about the long-term impacts of that on the country.
Macuba, it's a landmark transaction, right? I think not only for us, but for Mozambique. It was the first sort of large-scale solar plant in the country. It was the largest at the time of its construction. It was the largest in sub-Saharan Africa. It was one of the first projects in the region that was looking at climate resilience. It injects power closer to what is needed, so you avoid having to have long transmission lines. That from a climate perspective, and in a country that is hit by hurricanes and is hit by floods every now and then, it's a layer of protection. So all of that together, we think it's a landmark and the way to go forward in Mozambique.
It sounds fascinating. While I have you, I also want to ask about COVID-19. What's been the impact in Mozambique, and what does a resilient recovery look like in the country?
Mozambique is well positioned for a recovery, potentially for a quick one, because it has these projects to explore mineral resources that are already ongoing and the ones that will start. Right? So I think, again, we go back to the same issue. It's how much can they do? How much can Mozambique make these projects to be inclusive, right? So it's not something, an isolated project somewhere in far, but actually it translates into growth. So on one hand, I think it has a somewhat privileged position in the region. I think also it's an opportunity for a green recovery, for a sort of a green growth, because you will have a lot of agriculture and you will have tourism, which will touch on sustainability and resilience as well. We all will need to work on helping Mozambique develop the human capacity and the institutional capacity to really take on this big spur of growth that hopefully is coming.
And finally, probably the easiest question you'll get today. Tell me about the best part of your job. What inspires you in your role there working in Mozambique and the countries around it?
We see ourselves as an enabler. We are not... So our mandate to help reduce poverty is fulfilled by what our clients do with our money, what our clients do with our advice. Right? So, and ideally, we're trying to reach this state where the more commercial success of our clients, the more development impact, the more positive development impact. Right? And this is that's sort of the aim. So when you see it happening, you see that this is actually happening on the ground, and jobs are being created, and communities are better off, and the country has more power, or the country has more food, depending on the challenges. Then this becomes really inspirational, and it becomes a very positive feedback loop that inspires you to do more and to go the extra mile for the clients. I think that's, for me at least, that's the glue that keeps us together in IFC from my perspective.
Well, Hector Gomez-Ong, IFC Country Manager for Mozambique and a number of other countries in the region. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Hola, I am Jairo Bedoya in Montelíbano, Colombia, and you are watching the World Bank Group IMF Spring Meetings.
Well, Shri, just as we start to wrap up for the day here, run us through what we can expect for the next 3 days of the spring meetings in 2021.
Sure, Paul. So tomorrow it's all about debt and how countries can build a green and resilient future on that topic. And then we head into talking about climate and a green recovery on Thursday at 11 a.m. Washington, D.C. time. And I forgot to mention this, but the debt event starts tomorrow at 12 p.m. Washington, D.C. time. And then Friday, we wrap up talking about COVID-19 and vaccines. And that starts at 11 a.m. Washington, D.C. time.
Got it. And if anyone joined us late today, if they saw something they want to go back and rewatch from today's program, remind us how they can do that.
Absolutely. So you can head on over to our World Bank YouTube channel and catch back all the replays, and also head on over to live.worldbank.org, and there folks can go to the specific event pages as well and catch up on the conversation.
And I should be sure to mention that you, tomorrow, after tomorrow's debt event at about 1 p.m. DC time, so the event starts at noon, yes. About 1 p.m. DC time, you'll be in a live discussion with World Bank Group President David Malpass here on our headquarters set. So if folks out there have a question, get that in early. Go ahead and get those questions in early, because that helps us sort of get organized for tomorrow and get the best questions to the president. So post those at live.worldbank.org.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, until tomorrow at noon DC time, thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.